Welcome to NightDocs. Or tonight, should I say, welcome to the human element. Now, many of you know already that a few months back, I was hired by a smaller network to create a television series. And so I've been really hard at work trying to develop the ideas and the assets and just the scope of everything. And unfortunately, this last week, the network had a change in programming strategy for my show, as well as quite a few others. So unfortunately, the human element will not be airing on television like I had previously hoped. But the silver lining is that I was able to reach an agreement where I was able to bring home the assets and everything that I'd been working on and develop it, at least the pilot episode, into something that could approximate what you would have seen on TV had I been able to finish the pilot episode anyway. So the silver lining for that is that you'll at least be able to see the pilot episode here on NightDocs. Unfortunately, this may be the only episode ever of the human element. So the pilot episode was actually going to be about voter suppression and all the laws that are being currently passed in state legislatures across the nation. And although it's a very politically charged topic, I wanted to try and take such a complex issue and try as best I can to get past the lens of just politics and really try and focus more on how it relates to how it really relates to the very common human struggle and need to be heard. So what I'm going to show you today is an extended cut of an interview that I had yesterday with Representative Jasmine Crockett of the Texas House of Representatives, representing the 100th district near Dallas. Representative Crockett has been on the front lines in the fight against Texas SB7, colloquially known in the national news media as one of many voter suppression laws. The reason I wanted to show you this today, instead of go with the original plan of just show you clips from it interspersed throughout the episode that it was going to be a part of, is because during the interview, she revealed some things that I found quite alarming that have not been covered in the news media at all. This is just a microcosm of some of the things that are happening across the nation in many different state house legislative bodies. And the things that Representative Crockett told me during this interview, some of the things she said, they quite frankly really alarmed me. And some of the things she talked about have not been mentioned in the news, haven't been covered by anybody. So you're going to be hearing some things for the first time today that really give you a backroom look at some of the dark, shadowy things that happen in Texas, or probably different legislative bodies at the state level in the United States. And I felt like it was my duty to inform my fellow citizens of things that are going on right now. Some of these things the public never gets to hear about. So this is going to be a rare glimpse behind closed doors. Now, Texas SB7 had not passed and did not reach the desk of Governor Greg Abbott because the Democratic side of the aisle in the Texas Senate, they staged a walkout during the day of the vote so that a quorum could not be met and therefore a vote could not be held.
A quorum is apparently not present. Mr. Guerin moves the House adjourned at 10 a.m. tomorrow. His objection, chair hears none, so ordered.
So Democrats in the House, they walked out, meaning there weren't enough people to vote on a controversial election reform bill.
They were prepared to cut us off and try to silence us. We were not going to let them do that. And that's why Democrats used the last tool available to us. We denied them the quorum that they need to pass this bill, and we killed that bill.
Now, that was Representative Chris Turner for Tarrant County. He is chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and he actually texted other lawmakers telling them to discreetly walk off the House floor on Sunday, preventing voting on Senate Bill 7 before the midnight deadline. On one hand, Democrats call this bill voter suppression, while Republicans call it election integrity. The bill gives more power to partisan poll watchers adds restrictions for mail-in voting, and creates new felony punishments for voting violations. It sets uniform voting hours, which expands voting in some counties, but gets rid of efforts like Harris County's 24-hour voting or other expanded hours. Now, this bill would also make it easier to overturn election results. Those 4 SB7s say it's going to reduce voter fraud, but one of the biggest concerns is that the bill targets minority groups by limiting the ability to vote.
Now, Governor Greg Abbott has called for a special session of the Texas Congress to see this bill that has been, quite frankly, surgically designed to exclude as many people from disadvantaged communities as possible. Now, in an effort to be as fair as I can, I have been reaching out to many people on both sides of the aisle. I've been able to get a hold of many people from the Democratic side, many of whom are pretty eager to speak with me, as well as civil rights activists and things like that. A few of them weren't able to make time for me just because they were away with family and things like that, and I do want to respect that. I will say I've been able to get a hold of a few of the Republicans that have been really championing this bill, and almost none of them have really expressed any desire to talk to me at all about this topic. This is not something they want to talk about at all. In fact, I was actually able to get Representative Briscoe Cain, the co-author of this bill, on the phone yesterday, and he was, let's say, less than enthusiastic to talk to me or really anybody about this particular topic. And I hope he changes his mind. I would really like to bring as many voices as I can into this, at least people that have been involved in the process. Another one that I reached out to was Governor Greg Abbott's office. I spoke with his press office, and I went through the whole rigmarole. I sent them my press credentials. I sent them all the things that they would need in order to speak with me, and they just will not return my emails or calls or anything like that. They just do not seem enthusiastic about talking about this issue at all. So here is the extended interview with Representative Jasmine Crockett of the Texas House of Representatives, representing the 100th District. And if you stick around till the end, I'll even show you a little bit of a teaser for the full episode as it comes out. You just recently won your first term as a state representative, didn't you?
I absolutely did. I only laugh because winning is it's a relative term right now, but yes, I am in my first term.
So the big reason I wanted to talk to you today in particular was really about the legislation that has been trying to get pushed through the Texas legislatures. I know the SB7, it originated in the House. Were you a part of the process when they were voting on it and debating it?
Oh, absolutely. So SB7 initiated in the Senate. So we had HB6 first, but HB6 and SB7 were supposed to basically be like identical twins.
You chose a peculiar term in drafting this bill, and you talked about preserving the purity of the ballot box. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a quotation from the Texas Constitution. It'd be Article 6, Section 4.
Right. And are you aware of the history behind that provision of the Constitution?
I'm not.
Okay. Are you aware that references to, quote, purity of the ballot box used throughout this country's history has been a justification for states to disenfranchise groups they deem unfit to vote or somehow lacking?
I didn't know that. I thought it meant, I wasn't aware of that. I guess I thought purity meaning not having fraud in it or something.
That provision was drafted specifically to disenfranchise black people, black voters, in fact, following the Civil War. Did you know that?
No, I'm sorry to hear that.
Are you familiar with white primaries?
We've heard and read of such thing.
I'm glad
have you
read about those?
It's a disgusting thing. Yes.
Did you realize that purity of the ballot box language in the Texas Constitution gave rise to all white primaries?
No, I didn't.
And did you know that this purity at the ballot box justification was also used during the Jim Crow era to prevent black people from voting?
No, those are troubling things. I didn't know that was their
Did
reason.
you know that in states across the country that penal disenfranchisement schemes were put in place, including in Texas, as far back as 1845, to effectively lock African American people out of the political process? Are you aware of this history?
You know, I think we said a few times that I wasn't aware of any kind of malicious intent in the use of that term.
Okay. Because we have that history in place and the references in your bill that evoke some of that very dark history in our state, language is important, and the language you chose to use in this bill might reflect on one's intent, because if you are a student of the Texas Constitution, as you said you were, I think that might be probative, and that's why I wanted to ask those questions.
Yeah, good old Briscoe. You know, there was an exchange that we had on the bill, and I was like, either you don't know your bill or I don't know your bill.
Right.
And I was like, I'll be back with page and line numbers. And that's when I realized that they had really taken out like a bunch of different parts. And I didn't really know what they were doing at that time. So we finally realized they took out certain stuff. So all of the talk about the hours of voting, I was trying to ask him about that. He's like, oh, that's not in this bill. Like he just, oh, no, that's not in this bill. And I'm like, I have studied HB6. And if this is the mirror of HB6, then it's there. And so we realized SB7, they pulled it out. Well, they didn't want to debate it. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want a record on these things, right? So what they did is they pulled out these things that I was asking him about that he knew good and well they were going to add back in. So essentially they pulled it out. And then we were able to.
So they snuck it back in at the last minute?
They did.
What specific language was snuck back in at the last minute?
Oh, there was a lot. I don't know.
Like anything in particular that comes to your mind that really is glaring?
Definitely the voting hours. The voting hours was taken out. So when they did the substitute from HB6 to SB7, and I'm thinking they're mirrors, I'm trying to ask this question. And I was starting with the hours because I was like, please tell me, you know, what evidence you have of any fraud occurring at, 9 a.m. that doesn't occur at 12 p.m. Like, tell me how you get these hours. Like, I wanted to go through like that type of dialogue with him. And he was like, it's not in this bill. And I'm like, I know it's in the bill because there were hearings on it. I read the bill. So when we talk about there not being 24-hour voting available and limiting the hours of voting, as well as the Sunday hours of voting, that stuff had been pulled out of SB7 by the time it was in the House the first time. So I'm thinking he's literally not knowing his bill because it's not uncommon for them not to know their bills, right? But obviously this was a strategy. So this is the only thing he knew. So I go and I pull up SB7 in the current form and I'm like, this is not what, and so I was like, all right. And it was lawyers from Mexican American Legislative Caucus, Black Caucus, in the House Democratic Caucus and Republican lawyers. And it was just all these people, right? And they go into this room.
And they seem to be in support of this.
They are trying to advise leadership about what things definitely need to come off. Like, and so there's basically leadership and there's like those persons that were like authors on the bill. Like, so Briscoe was part of the conversation. And so they're negotiating. So about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, leadership comes to us and they say, hey, we've come up with a deal. This is what they're going to do. They're going to accept this amendment, that amendment, Everybody pulled their amendments down because we had filed maybe like 140 amendments on this bill. And so that was slowing the process up. Like, it was going to take forever. Like, I mean, we weren't getting through all of them. Like, it was just really bad. And so we were really slowing this bill up. So they looked through the amendments. They decided on some that they were willing to accept. But now we've made all these changes. So then it has to go back to the Senate for the Senate to either concur or ask for a committee. Okay. So the Senate gets it back And we didn't have any assurances, which was my concern. And the Senate is like, no, we won't concur. We'll appoint a conference committee. Well, the conference committee, obviously is a majority Republican committee. They didn't want to hear the minority voices at all. And then we have a committee on the House side as well that gets appointed. So now you're down to 10 people out of 181 that are going to make a final decision on what this looks like. And so sadly enough, they actually left out the Democrats and the few minorities, which of course came from the Democratic Party. They were left out of the conversation, and they passed this out of committee without their input, without their opinions or anything. And all those amendments that I asked, do we have assurances? They all were taken out.
So they lied to you.
Yes. But I expected them to lie.
Right.
Because they had been lying all session. They added all that information about the hours back in. They added all the criminal offenses or the felonious offenses back in. The majority of the felonies have been reduced to misdemeanor offenses in the version that left the House. So they created somewhere between 17 and 19 new felonies. Most of them were for simple mistakes. And in my opinion, it's to deter minorities or,
well, especially if it's a felony,
Black.
Once you've committed a felony, you're no longer able to vote.
Right. Well, so long as you've not completed your sentence. Exactly.
Okay.
So
that's
so,
actually,
yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something that confused me on the Crystal Mason case.
Yeah, that's some drama right there.
The genesis of this bill, what really was the genesis for it as far as what they were, like when they started bringing it up on the House floor?
Well, I mean, it was always going to be a priority item this session.
Sure. But like, I mean, it seems suspicious that there are so many election fraud conspiracies going around, and that's when all these different state legislatures turned out. And so it's like they're all built on fabricated information. And I mean, I've got the reports printed out here from Brennan Center of Law and all that, where they went back and they looked for voter fraud. Voter fraud, as far as malicious intent goes, it doesn't exist. And even the Heritage Foundation, where they have lists of all of the different voter fraud convictions that have occurred, 90% of them are just clerical errors.
Yeah. It's rhetoric, right? So for the Republicans, they're putting out this rhetoric because if you can suggest that there's some kind of wrongdoing, then you can build a coalition. But if you just say, hey, this is a power grab, you don't get there, right?
Right.
If you actually decide to tell what the real facts are, the facts are that Texas in the last decade has grown, but the majority of that growth has been brown people, right? So we've ended up with somewhere over 50% of our growth in the last decade has been due to the brown population. And then the Black population is right behind them with about 16% of the growth. And then it's Asians, and then it's Caucasians in the state of Texas. In the state of Texas, we are a majority minority state at this point. That is very scary, especially when you combine that with the fact that the closest margin that we've had in one of these presidential elections in quite some time came this last election cycle where Trump only won the state by 6 points. If we continue to trend the same way as far as our growth, the only way that Republicans will be able to stay in control is if they minimize those who are able to vote. People of color tend to vote more democratically. I can't say that all people of color vote in a certain party, but when you look statistically, that's not good for them, right? They need more old white men to move to the state of Texas if they are going to be potentially assured of their power. And so it's a power grab, right? But the Republicans are pretty dishonest in a lot of the things that they say. And so what they do is they stoke this fear and they tell people who are not in tune, who are not inclined to do their own research that, hey, there's fraud occurring. And for whatever reason, this same group of people is not inclined to question the legitimacy of the very people that are elected and telling them, hey, it's fraud.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying that I'm an illegitimate rep. I think that I legitimately won my race. The question is, Briscoe Cain, do you believe that there was fraud in your election and therefore you shouldn't have won? Or is it just this implication that anywhere a Democrat gets elected in the state of Texas, that's where the fraud is, and the fraud doesn't occur where the Republicans are? Because they also were doing kind of this twofold thing all session long, where a certain set of rules would only apply in the large metropoli instead of applying evenly across the board. We weren't going to implicate the same standards on smaller towns and rural areas. Same thing with voting. They were changing a lot of things. They're like, well, in a town of a size, less than 500,000, then the rules are different. They don't have to worry about this. So I'm like, I'm sorry. Are you saying that people in the city can't be trusted and people in rural areas can? Like, what? Like, it's ridiculous. I mean,
Right.
It's two set of rules, and it's all partisanship. They wanted to make it to where not only did they lower the standard of proof to be able to overturn an election. So the highest standard of proof that we have is beyond a reasonable doubt when we're talking about a criminal law case. The next level is clear and convincing evidence, which is what's necessary to have someone's children removed from them. That is the current standard that it takes to overturn an election. They wanted to reduce it to the same thing that we have, which is the civil standard, which is the preponderance level, which is just more likely than not. Do I believe this happened? Probably so. That's enough. Number one. Number two, they weren't going to require that you prove that actual fraud occurred. And because of that fraud, it actually changed the outcome of the election. You didn't need to do that. So if there was one fraudulent guy, I think there was something about a Republican somewhere that recently came out about how his dad requested a vote by mail ballot while he was alive, but he died before he received the ballot. So his son said, well, I just carried out his wishes and voted for him. So that was a Republican. But so he voted for himself and he voted for his deceased father. And in that particular circumstance, that would be something that is absolute fraud, right? But did it change the outcome of the election? This one situation, it wasn't changing the result of the presidential. But
the only fraud they ever find is from Republicans.
That is true too. That's true too. But it wouldn't be enough to change the outcome of the election, right? But under this new law, they would have been able to, somebody could have said, hey, I found out that Joe Blow did such and such. And it was fraud. And let's say he gets convicted. They would want to say, well, that's enough to overturn the entire election without proving that there was some element of widespread fraud to the extent that the results would have been different. And finally, the other part of it that was incredibly dangerous is they wanted to do like a little bit of forum shopping. And what that means is, if something happens in Dallas County, then it's tried in Dallas County. What they wanted to do is change the venue so that if they wanted to try to kick Democrats out of Dallas, they could go to a Republican area and say, hey, Judge, we think something happened over there. Undo all of this.
What's the reasoning they're giving for this?
They don't have to give reasons.
If they're going to argue for it, I mean, they submit it, and isn't there like debate on different amendments?
No. So on this one, no one ever filed a bill to this extent. No, so there were no hearings on it, so they never had to deal with it. And then because it was not part of what was actually like before the bodies, we never debated it. They actually did a resolution to go outside the bounds of what was actually in the legislation. So they had this out of bounds resolution that they tacked on that they did while in conference committee, where they added pages of language. And part of it was this. And I was like, what are they doing? I mean, and so they kind of got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, because once like we walked out, we killed the bill. They're like, oh, we don't know how that got in there. We didn't agree to that. That's terrible. That's a bad idea. And
of course, nobody knows who put the language in,
No,
right.
No one knows, because that's how we write laws, is no one knows how it gets in there.
There's no kind of log of like what language is added by who.
They just would have voted on it. Yeah.
So, I mean, honestly, the janitor could have come in the middle of the night and just wrote some pages and threw it in there, and that would have been submitted for vote.
Allegedly. That,
Right.
you know, we know the truth. I mean, once again, it goes just back to them being dishonest. They also said that on the souls to the polls issue, that it was a typo. So it was saying that no one could vote before 1 p.m. on Sunday. Why? like why? Right?
Yeah.
And they're like, no one can vote before 1 p.m. And so the bill author on the Senate side, the actual author, he says, well, that's so that poll workers can go to church. We want to make sure they have a chance to go to church. So we don't think we should open the polls before 1 p.m. And I'm like, so you don't have to be a Christian to be a poll worker. So I'm not really sure what that's about, right?
It's all on volunteer basis too, right?
It's seriously. I mean, well, they do get paid. So I mean, it's a work deal, but you're told the hours. So if church is going to be a conflict, I'm sure you may decide not to do it, or you may get someone to sub in, whatever, right? But not everyone goes to church.
Go work for Chick-fil-A if that's what you're worried about.
Yeah, no, that was the big deal. So it's so funny because they go, oh no, that was supposed to say 11 a.m. I'm like, but he defended that time. Like he defended 1 p.m. as the author. So I don't really know that it was a typo. And I don't know how you go from 1 p.m. to 11 a.m. You can't just say, oh, it was missing a 1. Like it's p.m. versus a.m. Like it's just ridiculous.
Well, Representative Crockett, I just want to ask you, like, because I'm feeling a little cynical right now. So give me a reason to be optimistic about just the next 4 or 5 years. In terms of voting rights.
You know what? You've got crazy people in Texas that decided that it was just that bad that they would walk out on it. And I think that we have...
Are you talking about the walkout in the...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So I think that we've ignited a fight that maybe we're not used to seeing in certain places. And I think that fighting spirit may end up spreading. I know that when we went to DC, they were so excited to see us, and they were talking about being re-energized, and they appreciated the walkout from the stance of now our colleagues can see how bad it is. It's not just us in their ears. Now they can see this is what these House members had to do.
And you say they, who are you referring to when you say they? When you said they were excited to see you?
Oh, all of the House members, as well as the Senate members, Democratic House and Democratic senators in DC. They were very excited to see us come up and continue the fight and be willing to tell our personal stories of what's gone on in the chamber and how difficult it's been, and the fact that there's not been any reasoning. The best reasoning that we've had at all on this voting bill stuff was the general public. It was walking out and this being on national news and certain things being highlighted. And of course, some of these things are even coming back from some of their constituents. Like, are you serious? Rural Texas is losing population every single day. It's urban Texas, it's growing. And so we know that in rural Texas, they do a lot more vote by mail because you may only have a couple of polling locations because everybody's kind of spread out. And so to do things like say, well, if somebody assists you with doing your vote by mail because you have a disability, they have to also affirm that you have a disability. And I'm like, do people normally ask, what is your disability? Like, that's just a very weird thing. Somebody may have a disability that's not visible. So having people do all these sworn affidavits, or this idea that if there's more than 3 people in a car that are going to vote, then you as a driver have to explain why you're taking this many people to go vote. You have to do a sworn document as well. I mean,
why do they have such an issue with, like, it's like anytime there are buses of people going to a polling location, it's immediately flagged as something suspicious. There has never been a confirmed case of anything like a voter fraud caravan. Caravan seems to be one of their favorite words, I swear.
It's not that they're afraid of fraud. They're afraid
of losing their power.
People voting.
Yeah.
They can limit the number of people that have access to the ballot box, then they can win.
Just in total. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because when it comes to it, like I had to fight against legislation that was anti-unhoused persons. If you're a rich Republican, you're looking out for your rich Republican friends. Like we have some trust fund babies in the ledge, right? And they're looking out for themselves and their friends, and they feel like that's a service. But I'm looking out for the everyday person who doesn't have a voice, including those that maybe are suffering from mental health issues that have potentially driven them into a homelessness situation. And so when you start to think about giving access to the everyday working person who maybe doesn't have enough time in the day to sit and watch the news all day to find out what's going on because they're trying to feed their kids, they're trying to keep a roof over their head, they're trying to maintain their job, those are the people that they continue to want to leave out of the process. They don't want them to be involved. They want to frustrate the process so much for them that they say, forget it, because I can't take a risk of going to prison because I've got to take care of my kids, because it's not worth this risk, right? They want it to be to where they are deterring, which is also known as suppressing, the everyday working person. And the problem is that the majority of Texas is everyday working people. The majority of this country is everyday working people. And so the fact that we don't want them to be involved in the process, that's not supposedly in the land that we live in. We supposedly live in a democracy where everyone is supposed to have a voice, but they've really decided that only the privileged should be allowed to have a voice.
One thing I want to close out with is I want to play that montage really quick that I sent you really quick and just kind of, let you watch it again in real time and then kind of get your reaction on the other side. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You know that a lot of Republicans since 1984 in the presidential races have not been able to win in Wisconsin.
Well, I think Hillary Clinton is about the weakest candidate the Democrats have ever put up. And now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
We are focused on making sure that we meet our obligations that we've talked about for years. Pro-Second Amendment, the Castle Doctrine's done. Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania, done.
In districts like the one I cover, which is held by a Republican, I would think that a strategy of the NRCC would be to try to keep those new voters who might be voting for Obama from, in fact, continuing on down the ballot. Does the NRCC or the Republican Party have any strategy for trying to ensure that that happens?
Well, you're talking about voter suppression, and we would never, ever do anything along that line for the record. No, I think it's fair to say we're not going to spend any money educating them on what they need to do, but that's what you do in these kind of elections. I'm just saying, in terms of vulnerability of our congressional candidates, you've got to look at these high African American voter, urban-style districts, and recognize that it's not business as usual as a candidate, that you're going to deal with an electorate that is significantly different from what you see in office.
It was a concerted effort nationally with lots of money going into it. Trump won by 620,000 votes in Texas. Harris County mail-in ballots that they wanted to send out were 2.5 million. Those were all illegal, and we were able to stop every one of them. Had we not done that, we would have been in the very same situation. We would have been on election night. I was watching election night, and I knew when I saw what was happening in these other states that would have been Texas. We would have been in the same boat. We would have been one of those battleground states that they were counting votes in Harris County for 3 days, and Donald Trump would have lost the election.
So, Ken Paxton over there, almost laying it all out. I mean, he's basically taking the mask completely off, saying the only reason that Texas went blue or went red in this last election was because they got rid of 2.5 million votes. And he made the assertion that all of them were illegal, which you can't say that. I mean, there's no way to prove that, right?
Now, I mean, you've got to be proud to live in a state where A.G. Paxton is the one who's deciding who's committing crimes and who isn't, considering his indictment situation. Everything that we need to know is front and center.
Mm-hmm.
There is no questioning. There is no guessing. There was no fraud. For Republicans, if they lose, it's fraud. If you think back to the president, the prior president, that is, he said, if I lose, that's because they cheated. That was before any votes were cast. Now, the last I knew, he wasn't Miss Cleo. So I don't understand how he
That's an old reference right there. Wow. Nobody knows who Miss Cleo is anymore.
Yeah, no. But I don't understand how he had some globe that told him that the only way you will lose is if there's cheating, right? But he really set the stage. He knew that he had not done what he needed to do to really address the vast majority of this country. And sadly enough, that's exactly what we see happening over and over and over across this country. But if you look at the majority of this state, or if you look at this state as a whole, Trump really wasn't in a winning situation in this state. If the attorney general of the state said the only way Trump was going to win is if we made sure that, you know, that colorful place known as Harris County, make sure that a lot of those people don't vote. And so this idea that access equals fraud is really more so saying Black, brown, poor, and working. If you guys get into the game, if you guys realize your power, then we've got a problem. That's all it means. They are right now playing really a white supremacy game, and it's dangerous. You know, that is what's led to the vitriol. That's what's led to the division. And sadly enough, that's what's led to things like the insurrection. It's led to the violence because it's really a white supremacy issue that they are pushing. That is who they are stoking up right now. That is who they are exciting. Instead of looking at the fact that Texas has more African Americans than any other state, instead of trying to work to earn the support and the confidence of African Americans, they make African Americans double down and say, there's no way I can participate in this party because this is the same party that wants to do things like throw me in prison for making a mistake. But the very guy that will be responsible for that prosecution enjoys privilege right now in that he's had felony charges pending for 6 years that he's never had to face his day in court for.
Yep. And if you're a white judge in, say, Dallas County, you know, you can get away with even writing names onto the ballot and sneaking them on, you know. That's a whole other bag right there. Well, Representative Crockett, I cannot thank you enough. This has actually been a fascinating discussion, and I had the episode pretty much written out, and there's a lot of parts I think I'm probably going to scrap and rewrite to accommodate some of the stuff that you were talking about, actually, because that some of that stuff is wild, especially about the process of getting that bill through. So, well, thank you so much.
No, not a problem. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Any parting words that you'd like anybody to know? Anything you'd like to plug at all?
You know what? I just want people to know that if you've ever said, oh, my vote doesn't count, you should know now. Your vote counts.
Now more than ever.
No one would be fighting so hard to make sure that it was more difficult for people to vote. And don't let people tell you that it's easy to vote. Yeah, if you're, you know, doing fine and doing well in life, then having a license and being able to walk in and vote may not be a big issue. But if you've been struggling financially, which so many of us are struggling, whether it's due to the pandemic, because you lost your job in the pandemic, or because of illnesses, and so you've had to take off and take care of family members, anyone could find themselves in a financially distressed situation. And so we have people oftentimes that don't even have a valid license because they're afraid to, or they're unable to pay tickets, right? And so then they don't go get their licenses renewed. And so there's a lot of things, but should that mean that they shouldn't be able to participate in government? No. You know, why is it that a college student has to go through the effort of, say, getting a driver's license or a state ID when they have their ID from their school, oftentimes a state school? And for whatever reason, you can't use the state school ID, but you can use your license to carry to vote. It's just those types of hindrances, not wanting young people to be heard, not wanting those that may be in a financially strapped situation to be heard. It's not so simple. And the reality is that we all should push for an open, free, and fair election. And so if anyone is pushing to minimize who has access, you have to question why they're doing that. And it's because they really just don't have a genuine interest in serving the people. They just are there to serve themselves.
Well, this has been Representative Jasmine Crockett she's a Democrat serving the 100th District of Texas. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Well, thank you again so much. It's been an honor to speak with you, and really looking forward to seeing where all this goes.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.